How's it going, everybody? Darren here, aka Dr. Dev. In today's video, we'll be starting off a series which aims to help you learn to program using C#.NET in an as clear and easy to understand way as possible. Now, while this series will be aimed at complete beginners who potentially have no idea where or even how to start, please don't jump to the conclusion that it'll be useless to you if you already have prior C# knowledge or programming knowledge in general. I strongly suggest that you follow along regardless of your skill level because you will most likely learn something new. So I've set up a virtual machine here with absolutely nothing on it just except for Google Chrome. And the reason that I've done that is so that I can show you how to get started with programming right from the very beginning. Before we start writing any code though, we're going to install something called an IDE. So what is an IDE? Well, an IDE is an integrated development environment. Put simply, it's an application which comes with most of the tools that we will need for development built right into it. IDEs usually consist of a source code editor, tools for building our applications, and a debugger, which is basically a tool that we use to test and debug our applications. Now we're going to be using Microsoft's Visual Studio throughout this series, although if you want to use a different one, by all means, please go ahead. So now that you know what an IDE is and what exactly it's used for, let's go ahead and download our one, which, as I said earlier, is going to be called Visual Studio. So I'll open up the Chrome browser, and in Google search engine, I'm going to search for Visual Studio 2017. Hit search. And now the link that we want to click, guys, is visualstudio.com/downloads. Make sure that this is the one that you click. Once it loads, we will see that we have 4 options to choose from here. Now these are varying levels of the Visual Studio product, but the one that we're interested in is the one here on the left side called the Community Edition. And the reason we want this one is because this version is free and it's ideal for us open source or individual developers. So go ahead and hit the free download button on that one, and once it's finished, we will go ahead and run the application. So now that my download's finished, I'll click to open it, and once prompted like this, I'll hit the run button, let it do its thing, and now we see the UAC prompt, or the User Account Control Prompt. So before we blindly just click yes on this, I want to make sure you guys understand what's going on here. The UAC Control Prompt is a layer that Windows have put on your machine to help you to identify when an application is looking for administrative access. And that's important because if you have some sort of malicious software running on your machine and it's trying to install something or look for something that requires administrative access, the UAC prompt is going to let you know, hey, this application wants to be an administrator. Is that okay? It wants to run as an admin. Is that okay? And this is an additional layer that you have where you can say, oh, actually, I didn't run that. No. But of course, in this case, guys, we're going to hit yes because it's Visual Studio. We know what it is and we want it. So now we see the first window within the installer telling us that it needs to set up a few things before we can actually go ahead and continue the installation. So that's fine. Hit OK or continue. Let it do its thing. I'll pause the video here, guys, and I'll bring it back online once we're finished. Now that the initial download and install is finished, we are brought to the kind of, I like to think of this as the main hub for Visual Studio components. This is the place where you can go and you can come back to afterwards to decide what exactly will be installed alongside your Visual Studio installation. Now, as you can probably see here, and I do urge you guys to do a bit of investigation for yourself. Don't rely just on the video to understand what's going on. Take a look around, make yourself familiar with it, because more likely than not, in the near future, you will come back here and look to install some additional things yourself. You might want to pick up web development, for example, or UWP development, or whatever it may be. But the important thing to understand for now is that all we care about is the .NET Desktop Development Package. So we're going to click the little checkbox for that to make sure that that gets installed. And everything that comes with it by default is all we need for now, guys. So we can go ahead and hit the install button, or if you want to change the location to which it's going to be installed, that's fine. But once ready, just go ahead and hit the install button. Now this is going to take a fair amount of time, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video once again, and I will be back as soon as the download has finished. So now that the download and installation of Visual Studio has finished, we are greeted with this little welcome dialog asking us to sign in. Now, we don't necessarily have to create an account and sign in to actually use the community edition of Visual Studio. However, as far as I'm aware, you will only have 30 days of usage before you are forced to actually create an account and sign in. So I suggest take a moment now, pause the video, go ahead and create your own account. It's free. There's no problem to do that. All you do is click on this little link here where it says don't have an account, sign up. Click the little link, create an account and sign in. As I said, guys, it's free, and once you do that, you've got Community Edition for free forever, okay? But for the purpose of this video, we're going to do that later. So I'm going to hit not now, maybe later. So we'll get started now. So here we're asked to choose the theme of preference for us. I'm just going to go with the light theme because I quite like the light theme, but you guys can pick whichever one you want. And then I'm going to hit Start Visual Studio. So it's going to do some preparing for the very first use. Usually this takes a little bit of time first time around, and every time thereafter it'll be quite quick to start Visual Studio. So I may pause the video here and I'll be right back as soon as this is finished, guys. So now that that's out of the way, we're taken to this Visual Studio start page. And as before, guys, I strongly suggest that you spend some time poking around, familiarizing yourself with this IDE. Take a look at some of these links over here. They can be really helpful. But without further ado, for now, let's go ahead and continue. So to get started, what we want to do is create our very first project. But before we can create a project, we need to have what's called a solution. Now, lucky for us, Visual Studio automatically creates a solution whenever we create our very first project. So what is a solution and why do we care? Well, to give a short summary of a solution, it's basically a container for projects which tracks dependencies between them. Now, we're not going to get into dependencies this early on in the series. We'll cover that in a later topic. So that's all that you really need to know for now. It's basically a place where we group all of our projects together. So what's a project? Well, a project, on the other hand, is where we put all of our source code files, our icons, our images, data files, and anything else that will be compiled into an executable program, or that will be needed at some point in order to actually perform that compilation. So now that you briefly understand the difference between the two, let's go ahead and create our first project. So to get started, we're going to click on this Create New Project link, or alternatively, you can go File, New Project. And you can see this dialog that we're brought to here. This is where we select our starting templates for our new projects, where a template is basically a project type that starts out with the foundation already set out for you. That way you don't have to start from scratch every single time you want to create a new project. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in this series, we're going to be focusing on programming in C#, but by no means is that the only language that's supported within Visual Studio. You can just as easily develop with C++, Visual Basic, F#, and so on. But because we're going to be focusing on C#, I want you guys to make sure that you select the Visual C# drop down over here. And that will then allow us to see all of the available templates that we have installed on our machine. So we're going to go ahead and pick the console app template because a console application is pretty much the simplest and quickest to pick up as a beginner. So I'll select this template, and as a rule of thumb, always give meaningful names to everything. I'm going to repeat that because this is a very important thing, especially as a beginner. You need to get a habit. You need to develop this habit early on because it's hard to break later on otherwise. Always give meaningful names to everything. So I'm going to name my project, and it's important here, as I said, to give a meaningful name, but also to try your best to follow the C# naming conventions that are outlined by Microsoft. If you're interested in reading about the naming conventions, you should definitely take a look. I'll leave a link in the description so you can have a look at the C# standards. One of the topics are naming conventions. So in this case, for project names, you generally want to have a structure which looks like company dot product or technology dot whatever the feature is dot sub namespace. Now, I apologize if that's confused you. I'll explain it with an example, and we're going to name our project exactly like that. So company Dr. Dev, all right, dot. So what is the product or technology? In this case, we're doing YouTube tutorials. So YouTube tutorials. And what is the feature? So the feature is learning C#, because that's what we're doing with this particular project. We're going to be focusing on the learning C# aspect. But as a sub namespace or a sub feature, this project is going to be specific to beginner level, beginners. So we can see here immediately by looking at the name that Dr. Dev is the company, YouTube tutorials is the product or technology, learning C# is the feature, and this one is going to be aimed more specifically at beginners. And the reason we do it like this is because we'll probably create a new project in the future and it'll have the exact same name, but at the end it'll be intermediate or maybe advanced. And that way we have that separation of concerns. We can nice and neatly structure our entire solution, the entire hierarchy, and it just makes things a lot easier to manage and maintain. So similarly with the solution name, as we can see down below, we're being asked for a solution name. Now it's currently copying our project name. Don't do that. The solution name is going to house many projects, or can house many projects, as we talked about earlier. It's a container for projects, so it should have a slightly more generic name. Now, what I'm going to go for is actually, I think d/dev.youtube tutorials is perfect. That's pretty much straightforward. Maybe we can say c.c#, because C# is the feature. We're doing YouTube tutorials specific to C#. We probably won't put any F# tutorials or Visual Basic or C++ tutorials within this solution. So now that we've given both of these project and solution meaningful names which conform to the C# standards, we can go ahead and hit OK. We can see here that the template has filled in a few lines of code to get us started. But before we actually go into that and write any code or even talk about what's here, I want you to take a look over on the right hand side of Visual Studio to what is called the Solution Explorer. Now, the Solution Explorer is a visual tool which allows us to navigate through the logical structure of our whole solution. From here you can see all of your projects, which we only have one at the moment, the one we just created, and you can see all of the files within them. At the moment we have two files. We have app.config within this project and program.cs within this project, both of which of course the template has nicely gone and set up for us. Now I want you to take a look at this program.ces file. The .cs meaning C# of course. This is going to be where we put all of our source code. Now, you can have lots of files, you can have lots of different places where you'll write your source code, and in larger products or larger scale applications, that's what you're going to do. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to put everything into program.cs. All of the code we write is going to go into here. So I'll click that, but it was open by default anyways. And now that we're inside of it, you can see up at the top what are called using namespace statements. Okay, down below here we have something called a namespace. Here we have something called a class, and here we have something called a function. So I'm going to really quickly just leave some comments above each of these things just so that we can help remember what exactly they are. So to write a comment, we basically do a double slash followed by whatever it is that we want to comment. So in this case, I'm going to say using namespace statements. So this is a using namespace statements. Down here, this is going to be namespace of our file. Cool. Okay, so this is going to be class within our file. And down here we have a function. Now, the function that the template has created for us here, the static void main function, this is a very special function. It's not just any one. In this case, it's what we call an entry point. Right? And what that means is that once our application runs for the very first time, or every time we run our application, this function is going to be the first thing that gets executed by the application. So that's why we call it the entry point, because this is where all of the initial logic is first executed. Real quickly, just to go back, the syntax for comments, as you saw, I wrote double slash and it changes the color to green. This / syntax, what it does is it basically tells the C# compiler to just ignore anything that comes after it that's on the same line. So, and I say on the same line because that's important. If I do a new line and try to continue my comment, it will result in an error, as you'll see in a moment. See, we got this red line and it's saying, oh, a namespace cannot directly contain blah, 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 blah. But if I put my double slash before that, it becomes green and now it gets ignored by the compiler. And it's a very good habit to get into, to comment your code, especially in cases in which what you're writing might not be completely obvious. Generally speaking, it's better to write everything in such a way that it's obvious and meaningful and clear to understand as soon as you look at it. But sometimes that won't be possible and comments are needed. So let's start breaking this down. The first thing that I want to talk about is this namespace keyword over here. Now, a namespace is basically a way in which we can group together our logic or source code. And the way we do that is by using these open and closed curly braces that you see, the open one being here and the closed one being here. Now, what this creates is what we call in programming a scope. And that means that everything within those braces, which I'm going to highlight below, belongs to this namespace. It can only be accessed through this namespace, right? And similarly with the class, as we can see, it has its own scope, which are defined by these curly braces, which means that everything within its braces belongs to the class called program. Simple enough, right? That's called scope, and we'll get back to that in a later series. But for now, that's all you need to know. So a namespace groups together our logic into one place. Now, a class is something that contains functionality. I'll actually write that here. A class contains functionality, okay? This is where we write all of our functions and variables that we want to actually use, which each have a specific purpose, a logical purpose in the application, right? And up at the top here, we see the using namespace statements. So each of these things that are talked about, that are mentioned after the using statement, are actually namespaces, just like ours. This is our namespace that we've created. We can call it whatever we want, but it's good practice to give it the same name as the output project's name. But these are all namespaces. So system is a namespace. System.collections is a sub namespace within the system namespace, and so on and so forth. And if you remember what I just said a moment ago, a namespace is where code and logic is grouped together. So by using a namespace, we can get access to the publicly available code and logic that is within them. Great, okay. So let's get an example of that. So in our main function down below, as we said earlier, this is the entry point. So this is the first thing that gets executed whenever our application starts. Let's go ahead and print something out to the console, right? That sounds like a good way to start. So if we type in console, and console is a class, as you can see in the little data tip, console is a class which belongs in the system namespace. And we can get access to this class because up at the top here, we have said that we want to use this namespace, right? So we can say console dot, and now we get a little window popping up here, which is called IntelliSense. This is a little tool that Visual Studio has built into it called IntelliSense, which lets us see all of the publicly available fields and functions that reside on this object, on this class in this case. So what we're interested in is a function which has a name called writeLine. Okay? So we just write it like that. We do writeLine, and then we do open and close parentheses. And in here, we're going to put in a string or a parameter some text that we want to print out to the console. And whenever you want to write a string, you have to do quotation marks like this, okay? This basically tells the compiler that this is a string literal, and we want to put some text in here. So let's go ahead and put some text in here. Let's go ahead and say, hello world, just to be a bit cliche, why not? And you can see that we have a little red squiggly line, and that's saying that it's expecting a semicolon. So if we put a semicolon at the end of this line, everything looks okay, the squiggly line is gone. But why is that? Well, this little semicolon, what that means is that everything before it is one statement. And I am now, by putting the semicolon here, I'm telling the compiler that I am now finished with a single statement. And you have to do this for each of your statements, or else you won't be able to compile properly. Okay, so in this case, we're calling the system.console class, and we're calling the writeLine function that exists on that class. And if you read the comment here, it says it writes the specified string value to the standard output stream. So real quickly, before we start and test this code, I just want to access another function on the console called readKey. And the reason I'm doing that is basically this function just waits for the user to input something before it actually finishes executing. And the reason we do this is because if we don't, the command line is going to open and it's going to immediately close, and our application is just going to immediately terminate. So by putting the read key here, it's waiting for me to enter something before it finishes the application. And I'm just doing that so that we can actually see that the code that we wrote will work. So let's go ahead and start. Hit the start button. That's going to compile your code. And once it's finished compiling, it's going to open up the command line. And there you have it. Hello world. As you can see, the console opened up. It printed out hello world. And now it's waiting for us to enter a key because we wrote the line down here which said read key. And as soon as we enter a key, we can press anything on the keyboard here. As soon as I press anything, it's going to exit the application because this line has finished executing. It goes to the next line. It realizes there's nothing more to execute, so it terminates the application. And if just to show you real quick, if I comment this out, and as I said earlier, putting the slashes in like this tells the compiler ignore this line. So now that I've made a comment out of this code, it will no longer get compiled and executed. So it's the same as if I just deleted it. But because we want to keep it there, I'll just comment it out for the time being and start up. You can see the console started and it immediately closed. That's because the console did its write line function. It went to the next executable line, which is down here. It didn't execute this, of course, because it doesn't even know it exists. Went down here. There's nothing else to execute. So it comes out of the function and it terminates. So let's go ahead and uncomment out our console.readKey function because we're definitely going to need that to see what the heck we're doing. I think it's time now that we actually build upon this function a little bit, make it a little bit more complicated. And keep in mind, guys, that that's exactly what happens in the real world. Every single company that runs with a software framework, every single open source project, they all start somewhere small and they build upon it and build upon it and build upon it until they end up with a full large scale application. That's how it works. So don't be disheartened if you ever see thousands of lines of code. Always try to understand that they started small and built upon it. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So I think I'll introduce you guys to a string variable to get you started. And to do that, I'll just create a new line. And up at the top here, I will write string. And I'll give it a name, console prompt. And I'll give it a value, which is hello, what is your name? Okay, so what I've done here is I've created an object of type string. I've given it a name, which is an identifier that I can use to access the value within it. And then I've given it the value of hello, what is your name? And now this is great, right? So this is cool because what I can do now is I can take my console prompt and I'll just copy its name real quick. And if I go to my right line, instead of writing in my text hard coded like this, which is generally bad practice, I can actually go ahead and just paste in the name of my variable. And what happens here is when the write line function executes, it sees my variable and it goes ahead and gets the value from it and plugs it in. So it just plugs in the value of this variable in here. So what's going to happen then is it's going to console.writeLine, hello, what is your name? So let's have a look and see that that works. So I'll just go debug and I'll start without debugging for now because it's a bit quicker to start up if we don't use debugging. Because when you hit the start button by default, it starts with debugging, which is quite slow. So I'll hit start without debugging and let's see. So there you go. Look at that. Hello, what is your name? Perfect. It's exactly what we expect. So let's give it an answer, shall we? So we saw earlier that the console.readKey function is used, which waits for the user to put in a single key, right? But what if we want the user to type in a full sentence, which is what we want now? We want to type in, my name is Darren or something like that. What do we do? So let's have a look at the console class again. And let's have a look at the read option. So we have a read key, which reads the next character. Oh, sorry, we have a read, which reads the next character, a read key, which obtains the next character or function key, or a read line, which reads the next line of characters from the standard input stream. So that's what we want, read line. And what this function means is it's going to wait for the user to type in some text into the command line and hit enter. And once they hit enter, as you can see by the tooltip right here, it's going to return a string to us. So that string that it's going to return is actually going to contain the text that the user, which is going to be us, entered. So I want to store that somewhere, right? We want to be able to see what the user typed in. So just like before when we created our string up here, let's go ahead and create a new string called string response, let's call it. And it's going to be equal to the value of whatever the read line returns. Simple enough, right? So one final thing that we'll do is we'll print out a message which contains the response in it plus some additional text. So let's say console.writeLine. And here we can do some really cool things with adding strings together. So we can do this, right? We can say hello, and then I can do a space, and then I can do a plus response. So basically, let's just run it. Why don't we just run it and see what happens? Start without debugging, let it compile. Hello, what is your name? Okay, I'll put in Darren and I'll hit enter. Hello, Darren. So do you see what happened here? This is very powerful. When I've done my next console.writeLine down here, it's created a string called, which has the value hello, but it added to it whatever value I typed in. So it ends up being hello, Darren. And that's very powerful. Now, this method of adding strings together and variables using the plus operator is okay if you're adding maybe one variable. But if you're adding multiple variables together, it can become very, very slow and cumbersome and hard to write. So there's a more recent technique that you can use called string interpolation. I have a video about it. I'll link it in the description if you guys want to check it out. But an interpolated string basically looks like this. I do a dollar symbol, I open my quotation marks, and then I write hello, and then in curly braces, I put my variable. So that is a little bit easier to read. It's basically going to print hello response. So if we go ahead and run the application without debugging again, it's going to say, hello, what is your name? I'll say my name is Darren. You see, it's going to say hello, Darren, exactly as it did before, but this time it's using an interpolated string. And you're probably thinking, okay, well, this maybe doesn't look that much cleaner than the plus operator. But if we have multiple variables, as I said earlier, it immediately becomes a lot easier to write and much simpler to read. And let's get an example of that. So why don't we actually change this up a little bit? How about when we rename this variable to prompt for name, right? So you can see now after renaming this variable, I've obviously got a red line, squiggly line down here saying, oh, it can't find any variable called console prompt because I've just renamed my variable to prompt for name. But if you press down the control key on your keyboard, followed by the dot or the period, you'll see that an option comes up saying rename this variable to prompt for name. And if I click that, it'll update all of the references to this variable to the new name, so that they all have the new name that I've just changed it to. It's a really cool way, so you don't have to copy and paste all of your renames. So this is a string which is going to be prompting for name, okay? And let's change this string to be let's just change it to be user's name. And of course, again, control and dot. And then in this case, I'll just hit enter to rename it, and it updates it down here. So now it's going to say print prompt for name, and then we're going to get the user's response. And then we're going to say, let's do some new lines down here, and then we'll say console.writeLine. And up here, I'll actually create a new string called prompt for age. And this is going to be, how old are you? Right? Simple enough. Oh, I can't spell age apparently. And we'll have one more string at the bottom called prompt for occupation. What do you work as? Or let's say, yeah, that's fine. What do you work as is fine. So now we can say down here, I'll copy my prompt for age, and down here I'll prompt for age. So now I'll create a string called users age, and it's going to be equal to console.readLine once again. So what's going to happen here is it's going to prompt for the user's name, get the user's name and store it in this value, it is variable here. Then it's going to prompt for the user's age, and then it's going to go ahead and get their response and store it in a different value called user's age. And we'll do that one more time for the occupation. So console.writeLine. And this is going to be prompt for occupation. And finally, we'll create one more string called user's occupation. And that's going to be equal to the result of the console.readLine. So now you can see we have a lot more variables that we're keeping track of. And if we want to print this out to the console, this is exactly where an interpolated string becomes a lot cleaner to read. So let's go ahead and say, hello username, you are user's age, years old, and you work as a user's occupation. Like that. So now you can see that we're managing 3 variables and it suddenly becomes a lot easier to read. So it's going to say, hello, my name, you are however years old, and you work as a whatever your occupation is. So let's go ahead and try it out and start without debugging and see what happens. So here we got, hello, what is your name? Darren. How old are you? I am 24. What do you work as? Software developer. And enter. Hello, Darren. You are 24 years old and you work as a software developer. So this is incredible. You can see the amount of complexity that you can add just by creating a few variables and concatenating them together. So you can probably guess, guys, judging by what we've written here, that the execution starts from the top down, right? So when we come into the main function and it gets executed at the first run of the application, it creates all of these variables first from the top down. It creates all of those variables. Then the next line is going to be prompt for the name. And then the next line is going to be get the value back, and so on and so forth until it gets to the very end of the function. When it gets to the end and it sees this curly brace, it's going to exit the function. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up for this video here. I didn't want it to get too long, and I will indeed be continuing on. So I hope you guys have learned something. I hope it wasn't too confusing. Please do leave a like and a subscribe if you enjoyed the content. And of course, give me a comment and let me know what you felt. Was I going too quickly? Was I going too slowly? Was I not explaining things properly? Just, give me some criticism or some feedback, whether it's positive or negative. I'll take it all on board and I'll do my best to make sure that future videos are perfect for you guys. So thank you guys so much. I hope you have a wonderful day and I'll see you again next time.